Listen, we wanted to keep time at the end here because we knew that, as is true in every great academic setting, that there's actually much more wisdom in the back of the house than there is in the front of the house. And, we were able to bring some of you to the front of the house. But we really wanted to have the opportunity really to have a more open and an unstructured discussion with all of you about where you think, what the value, to pick up on what Jennifer said, what is the value that we as an academic research enterprise, which has the ability, as you've seen a glimpse of, but there's even more fascinating work being done to actually conduct research to try to get at some of the questions that were raised here. So if I'll just say three of them. I always say I'm not Catholic, but I think always in terms of three, so I'll just say three of them. The first is a discussion, almost a fist fight that almost broke out in the last panel, and that is, so how are we going to measure and evaluate this? Since Scott said at the very beginning, we have to measure and evaluate it in some way, and in fact, actually, we know that the fact that it is being measured and evaluated is actually going to help drive behavior. So that's why actually Esther, I remember, was part of a big push to get people to count pro bono hours. And then inside firms, it was to count those hours as being real hours and not just on top of everything else, as some people said is a real problem in some places in Latin America, I think you said. And of course, it's not just here, it's diversity. I did, that's where I began my work, and there was a huge push to get counting in diversity. But of course, what you get when you get counting is you get what I once wrote, so I'm an academic. I was hoping this would be on t-shirts. So far, it hasn't materialized. Visible, rankable signals have real power, and they begin to drive all sorts of behavior. And the visible, rankable signals in this context were tied to the context of the firms they were designed to influence, which means they were tied to hours, which means they were tied more broadly to input-based measures of value. And I think, as I've said in many other contexts, that one of the biggest changes that's going on in the world, which is being driven in part by the presence of sophisticated consumers like Jennifer, is that law is being pushed from an input-based system to an output-based system. Because, of course, the more you know, the less you care about the input, and the more you're interested in the output. The last time you went to buy a car, you didn't go ask to see the chief designer's credentials. You didn't actually ask how many hours it took them to assemble it. You drove it. And if that wasn't good enough, you read something else that helped you to measure what that value was to you. This is a challenge not just for pro bono. This is, I think, the major challenge of the legal profession today. How are we going to have metrics of value? And it can't just be what lawyers like to say, which is we know it when you see it. So, that was who said that? That was Justice Stewart, talking about something we should not want to be equated with, okay? So therefore, it can't be totally individualized either. So when people complain about U.S. News and World Report and they say, yes, we should just ban it, burn it, throw it out, then you say, okay, so how should they measure value? Old-fashioned, illegitimate hierarchy? What we know from what the few people tell us? So we actually have to own it. And this is one thing, it seems to be, that academic researchers can help with. And this is one of the challenges that Scott laid out at the beginning. And that leads to the second point, which is just, you can't study anything in isolation. This is why things are so complicated, but I thought one of the major themes that came out of all of the panels was that, what's happening in pro bono Australia has a lot to do with what's happening in the legal market in Australia. Or what's happening in pro bono in Brazil has a lot to do with the conflict about the opening up of the market. Also, it has to do with internal politics of the bar inside Brazil, but it also has to do with what the model of the developmental state is. So Jeremy and lots of other people are talking about what's the relationship between pro bono and legal services. That might even more broadly, and it was just a little bit hinted at Fiona, or maybe it was Lisa at the very end, to say, well, maybe it doesn't have to do with lawyers at all. Maybe it has to do with what we think of as the domain of the kind of help we're trying to provide and who gets to provide it, which has to do a lot with what is the domain of lawyers. And pro bono is in some ways a very lawyer-centric way of thinking about what the needs are that we're trying to address, okay? So the second thing is something like Scott said at the beginning, it has to be embedded in some larger understanding of what's happening in institutions and in the world. And then the last point is, maybe because I'm standing here as a professor at a law school, it has to do with what the motivations, interests, and aspirations of the people are who we are trying to encourage to do this kind of work, and how those motivations, interests, and aspirations are changing as a new generation is coming in who sees the world in a different way. Louise's point a little bit about, here we have this thing where we have all these LLM students coming here and they want to take the New York bar in part because they want to be a part of the increasingly globalized legal profession, but that means it comes with certain kinds of ideas about what they have to do. How do we understand what those motivations and aspirations are? Is the right way to think about it the business case? Again, in diversity, there's been a lot of discussion about this. It has many virtues. It also has many traps, because if you locate everything in the business case, then you have to be located in the logic of the business case. And the logic of the business case, as I think you just said, very pointedly and honestly about what's going on in law firms with de-equitization and increasing competition and hyper-competitiveness, it leads to things like an extreme view of what's happening with positional conflicts of interest. You're Coke, I'm Pepsi, we can't do that. So these are things that I hear in this incredibly interesting discussion from all of you. And I guess the question I want to ask, and I don't know if Scott, you want to, is what is it that we could do to help from the position that we're in? And I think this isn't, questions to me or questions to Scott, although you could feel free to ask them or the other researchers who are in the room. But it's really a conversation, and I guess we wanted to set aside time to hear your thoughts. That's your cue. And now Hakeem is going to run around. But see, I could say Phil Donahue in this crowd because most of you remember him. And, you don't have to have any thoughts now. Let me just say, I'm not going to call on anybody. That's another thing that we do in law school. I notice it just like in every law school class. Thank you for sitting in the front row, by the way, okay? Almost no one ever sits in the front row. You know where we live, okay? We're not hard to find. We've got a website that features information on the GLEE project, and one of the things that we promise you, so this is being recorded and it's going to be put up on our website, and we're going to try to find as many ways as we can to engage with all of you as possible. We're going to try to keep you posted about the research that's being done in ways that are accessible to all of you. So yes, we do publish very long law review articles and books that, the three of us or four of us will read and will be used as maybe doorstops. But we will also, as our commitment to engaging with all of you, try to deliver it in ways that are open and accessible and subject to debate and criticism from your perspective. Yes, please. I knew if I talked long enough, I would encourage someone to say something.
Last part of the day actually ruffled feathers when Scott proposed this, as it's just as important to ask what the effect is on the community as it is to ask whether, lawyers, something that was all sort of selfish about lawyers and lawyers contributing meaningfully. And I think I've turned around in that in the last 4 hours, because one of the things that I think we are missing as a law firm community is a confirmation. I think volunteers do things for two reasons. They want to know that they had an impact outside of themselves, and they want to know that they have an impact inside of themselves. And there's very little science of any kind available to us to measure that self-satisfaction in lawyers. You really will be happier. You really will lose weight. You really will be taller. You really will be cuter. All of that stuff that we say all of the time, but we unfortunately say it in the context of, we hear it in the context of exit interviews from law firms and not in the right up front. And so to the extent that you guys are thinking about what the studying community could do, it seems lately we see a lot of studies that say this is the best place to work in the world. This is the best law firm to work in the world. This is the best corner of the best law firm to work at in the world. So obviously there's ways that people measure these things, but we don't get them in the pro bono context, and we could use them.
Other thoughts? Yeah, please.
So I'll be brave and talk from the NGO nonprofit perspective. I've become very aware of lately, after years of doing this, is that other than maybe anecdotal information, there's been no research I've seen where people come back to an NGO or a nonprofit who's been maybe the consumer of the pro bono work and say, was it valuable? What worked? What didn't work? What were the things that were positive? What were the things that were negative? So I'd be really thrilled if there was some study somewhere that took that cohort in this pro bono matrix and had that cohort included.
In other words, the recipients, right? Other thoughts? Comments? Yeah, please.
I would just pick up Marlene's comment and agree with that. In the time that I've been involved in this work, I've, with one exception, not had a firm come to me and say, how are we doing? Do you think we're, a good pro bono firm or a really good one, or could we improve in certain ways? And we don't, and I'm happy to own this, we don't proactively go and say to firms, well, actually, this area of work that you put on your website and say you're really good at, we don't see that. We think maybe you're good at this stuff, but some of that stuff not so good. I mean, that's a really difficult conversation for us to have. But it's not something that firms very often provoke. And that's not for any, the people are all wanting to do good work and are often doing good work, but we sometimes think better work could be done if there was a more open dialogue about impact and outcome. And yeah, so it would be interesting to explore that. I think if you're talking about research, what are those dynamics? I know Scott's looked at that a little bit already, but it would be good to explore that a little bit and create a safe space where it can be explored further.
So we've got Jennifer over here who's probably going to say they don't do it even when we're paying for it. But
Just
yes,
don't feel
that's
bad. They don't do that
and
one,
then
even
over
when we're on the for-profit side. So it's rare that a law firm reaches out to me and says, "How we doing?" We have undertaken to more often reach out to them and tell them how they're doing. And actually, one of the projects that we've been working on in my team is to think about how do we do our own dialogue with the firm that's consistent after every engagement, however we decide to define that, so that we actually reach out and give the feedback and have that dialogue engagement by engagement. So I do think it's a two-way street. I think that if you're not getting that from the firm, you have to go out and create that. And I think that then leads you to the discussion of value that Professor Wilkins was talking about. I think that once you're having that discussion about how'd you do, then you will have a discussion about, here's how you did, here's how you could have done better, and oh, by the way, here's the value we got out of it, and here's what we got absolutely no value out of. And we're still going to pay you for it. Yes, you were billing us by the hour.
Oh,
but you
you're
should
being
understand-
nice, Jennifer.
Yeah, but you should understand next time, we're not going to pay for that. And next time, that didn't give us value, so we need to figure out a way to carve that out of the engagement, if I'm being nice. And some days I'm not that nice. But.
So over here and then over here. So here first and then here. Yeah.
Well, and I do think it's interesting, Jennifer, that you say that because, of course, there is no paying going on. So I feel like in the pro bono, it's always interesting because so say that we represent you on an IP matter and you come back and you say, it was great and we have this other M&A transaction. Our firm wants that because we want to keep getting paid. So on the pro bono, sometimes that factor of whether there's paying going on, I think impacts it definitely. And I think one of the things that really strikes me always when we work with NGOs is something I stole from Susie Turner, my good pal, is what's really important in the beginning, and Susie and I have both done it, is where she'll pretend to be the firm and I'll pretend to be the nonprofit, and we're not getting it at all. She'll tell me that she has 4 lawyers available, M&A lawyers, 4 o'clock in the morning, every other Tuesday, and I'll say, well, I need $10,000 contribution before we can start working together. And I don't know what her firm does, and she doesn't know, like we're just not investing in that. So I think one of the keys with these relationships, as it would be with Jennifer, is, hi, we're blah, blah firm. This is what we're good at. We're good at the complex Latin America matters that really suits Dina. We don't do anything in Eastern Europe much, so maybe Ed's projects are not going to ring true. So it's so much about investing in that relationship, and not that the nonprofit is coming to beg me, that they have something I want, and I also need a clearinghouse, and I'm happy to pay for that because that's business development for me as the person in charge of pro bono at my firm. So I think not enough can be said about investing in those relationships to get the good matters and the good back and forth. Did we do well? Did we not? I mean, if I don't know what you do and you don't know what I do, then that's never going to happen. So I think you have to really plow that in at the beginning.
Terrific. Thank you. Up here, Derek. Thanks. And I'm watching, so keep your, Aminu, or was that just,
I just wanted to follow up on this discussion. I'm a little surprised to hear that there maybe is some uncertainty about the provision of services to an NGO, which is the source of the pro bono referral. At least in my experience, there's a very strong trend toward partnering between certainly our firm, and I think a lot of firms, with particular NGOs with which you have a continuing relationship. And we have, at least with respect to the work that I do and that I try to coordinate at our firm, we have very close communication between us and the organizations that have asked us to do work. And secondly, I know nobody wants to talk about numbers anymore, but I will say with respect to the relationship between NGOs and firms, and I appreciate, Jennifer, that no general counsel feels that they get value from the hourly rate, but the NGOs regularly ask us how many hours were devoted to this particular project, and do the multiplication of the hourly rate to those hours, because our funders want to know what the actual dollar contribution was from our law firms.
So, Aminu, back in the back. One of our superstar SJD students.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you, everyone, for doing this. I think this is very important. I am David's student. I'm a doctoral student here from Nigeria, and this is something that is new to us. So you can imagine if it is new to you, it is really very, very new to many of us. I've been one of the advocates in my own country, and I would like to share with you some of the pushback that we hear from people. Every time I talk about pro bono in corporate practice, people tend to see that as an oxymoron because for many law firms, especially in Africa where there is deep inequality and many structural problems, the law firms are seen as representative of certain special business interests. So the fact that there is a small unit within the law firm that is doing a feel good, look good pro bono service, which doesn't really tinker or change the nature of their practice, to some people, they are very skeptical about that, and even the NGOs are saying, well, they are the same people who are representing the corporations, they are the same people who are representing the oil companies that are damaging the environment, and you think that they can do good in one or two few cases. So these are some of the possible pushback, but I'm very optimistic that this is really quite a good thing, and I'm glad that David is doing this because it is exactly a gathering like this that will bring together people to share thoughts and ideas. I was watching from my own home with my little daughter the whole conversation, courtesy of technology, and one of the
She
things
was,
that
you were trying to put her to sleep? Is that the
and one of the things that I am interested in is how do we share best practices? Somebody spoke from Brazil. How do we use technology perhaps to enhance what is going on? We know how technology is changing not only legal practice, but the way courts are operating. So one of the clinics that I worked with in Nigeria, university-based clinic, and I like it, David, when you mentioned the students and their motivations. Every person who has gone to the law school, almost in every country, belongs to an elite group that ultimately wants to make money, and even if he doesn't want to make money, he wants to make difference. So the question is, how do we make people who dedicate their time in the university doing pro bono service to be as competitive and not to starve when they go to the legal market? Because I've seen instances where you go to a meeting of lawyers, and the moment you introduce yourself as a public interest lawyer or a human rights lawyer, that is, the conversation wouldn't go further. So how do we really make it appealing to everyone so that it doesn't really sound as if this is something left for the oppressed, the marginalized, and those who are fighting for the poor? I think that is something that we need to think about. And finally, dealing with international clients. I know the clinic here at Harvard and in other institutions within the US have been trying to globalize a particular model. And one of the key challenges, like any transplantation, is that may not really necessarily be suitable for the environment to which you are transplanting those new concepts and ideas. And I think without overemphasizing the cross-cultural and interdisciplinary collaboration, I think a project like this is really good, and I am glad that, David, you are doing it, and I look forward to participating more and learning more from the people who are doing it, especially from the perspective of the corporate and big law firms. Thank you.
So I'll just say Aminu's dissertation is on the development of legal education in English-speaking countries in Africa, with a particular emphasis in Nigeria, but for all the English-speaking common law countries. And for those of you who are interested in Nigeria, I told Ed I was in Nigeria, I think 2 weeks before him, and I was actually in, who was doing the pro bono thing at FGV. I was there 2 days before that. But if you're interested in Africa, Aminu is a really wonderful expert and guide in helping to think about the complex ways in which that legal market is evolving, and he's also a terrific tour guide. So, other thoughts? Yeah, sure, Louise, thank you.
A follow-up to that comment, there was earlier discussion today, not in this context, but another, about South-South communication. And I think that is something we could think about in writing about the pro bono. I mean, it doesn't have to go through necessarily the global law firms and down to the countries. You could have context like the Brazil and Nigeria context. and contacts. And so that's something to think about moving ahead. I feel very strongly that we need collaborative projects where people from the various countries are working together on this, not having to go up, the vertical, but the horizontal. And your point about you're sitting there you could be sitting in Nigeria and watching it too on the web. And so we really have to take very seriously that ability to communicate that way and how we can set up the network. So that is a research issue too, whether or not that's possible to do that and break away from the vertical and have the horizontal outside of the global law firms being the only conduit, have conduits of contact besides those.
Thank you. Other thoughts, comments? It's been a long day, but an incredibly rich and productive one. I say to people all the time, I always am very mindful that the most important resource that all of you have is your time, and the time that you come and spend with us away. As someone once said, your day jobs, even though your day jobs are this job. But, for me, this is my job, and so I could just stay here all day. But rather than stay here all day in this somewhat formalized way, why don't I turn it over to Scott, who really, without Scott, we wouldn't be here, if he wants to say a word or two. And then from my point of view, I just want to say I hope that this will be the beginning of many rich and long conversations that don't just go through the moderator or go even through the project, but amongst yourselves. I mean, most of you know each other, but I hope you met someone you didn't know so well before, or listened to someone you didn't know so well before, and make that connection, because another of the big things that's transforming the world is from moving from kind of siloed firms to networks. And the most important thing here is to create a network that's a network for change. But why don't I turn it over to our number one change agent to gavel us to a close.
I am the only thing that's standing between you guys and getting out of here, having a drink and having dinner, so I am going to be incredibly brief, and I want to reiterate David's thanks to all of you and how grateful we are. My mind is buzzing. I think it's been such an exciting and energizing day. A number of us, Louise, Bob Granfield, who was here, Fabio, other people in the GLEE project are really trying to put these different pieces together into a larger research project, and this has just been enormously helpful for us in doing that. And so I thank you. I would just end by saying, please keep the channels of communication open. I think the questions that came up and the comments during the end are really excellent in helping frame and think about the relevant factors that we need to address in developing the research project. But I want to keep those channels open, and I really invite you to contact me or other people. And again, just to say thank you, and I hope we carry on.
Thank you. One last thing. Someone's life was left up here. Is Lisa still? Okay.
It wasn't her.
I know what this would be like. So if anybody hears of anything, we will take possession of it unless we hear differently. If there's mobile banking on there, we will finance the program. No, excuse me. But
Oh, no, not Ed. He left.
Ed?
He left, yeah.
But it's sitting here. So anyway, I will keep hold of it. All right. Give yourselves a great big round of applause. Thank you very much.